Hi, I'm Jamie.
And I'm Lada.
We have always wanted to make our own live edge dining table, and we finally got the time.
Yeah, and we watched a bunch of videos to make this table, so we thought we'd make our own.
We hope you enjoy.
This is where we started. We found a 9-foot slab of figured redwood that we fell in love with. It had been aged for about 2 years to dry out, and it was ready to be worked. Redwood wasn't my first choice since it's a softer wood, but we figured we'd give it a go. We had the mill plane both sides and cut off about 2 feet at the wider end, so we'd have a 7-foot table, which worked for our space. This slab was fairly pristine with no notable voids, just a few hairline cracks. To fill the cracks, we used normal fast-dry epoxy, and we decided to mix it with charcoal dust since epoxy will inevitably yellow over time. Another option would have been to mix it with sawdust from the slab itself. We spread the epoxy in every hairline crack we found, and then we let it dry. In actuality, we did this about 4 times because we kept finding new tiny cracks we wanted to fill. After it had dried, we needed to remove the epoxy, and this proved a little more difficult than I expected. Many videos I watched showed people sanding the epoxy down. When I tried this, however, inevitably the soft redwood around the epoxy began to wear away. I tried a chisel, but that also proved a little too heavy-handed. Eventually, I saw a video of a guy using a card scraper. I didn't have one, but I did have a rather sharp-edged spatula I could bend in a similar way, and it actually worked really great. Once the epoxy was mostly flush, the sanding began. Safety gear is important here. I made sure we used respirators, eye protection, and ear protection. Hooking up my orbital sander to the shop vac was a huge help and almost eliminated visible dust. From here there was lots of sanding. Originally, to wear down the mill marks, I began at a very low grit, 40 or 60. This was a mistake though, as the soft, lighter parts of the wood grain wore away much faster than the darker winter growth. I knew nothing about this before I started and was pretty amazed as the surface began to feel bumpy under my fingers. The fix was to switch to a higher grit that would not wear down the wood as fast. Eventually, I settled on 2 passes at 120, a pass at 150, and a final pass at 180, which was the finishing grit recommended for the sealer I wanted to use. The last part was to sand the sides. The bark had already been removed, but there were still fibers on the surface, so I removed those and then hand sanded all of the edges to lightly round them for comfort. I'll switch now to the project of making the legs. I had a design in mind I'd seen online consisting of 2 trapezoids made of rectangular steel tubing. I knew nothing about welding, but luckily a friend's dad was taking classes to help him restore an old truck, and he agreed to help me. It was quite the learning experience and took a huge amount of time. I'm definitely glad I did it, as it really demystified working with metal for me. I think a lot of casual DIYers are intimidated by metal, but with the proper tools and know-how, it opened up a lot of possibilities. That said, if I had bought pre-made legs, this project would have been done a lot sooner. I ordered 3" by 1" 16-gauge rectangular steel tubing and some 5" by 4" flat bar to use as the mounting plate. I wanted the mounting plate wider than the tubing to help prevent side-to-side wobble. I followed the dimensions of a version I had seen online, which came out to roughly 30 inches wide at the top, tapering to 20 inches wide at the bottom. This made for some pretty strange angles that complicated things a little bit, and in fact, I had to bring the steel tubing to a metal shop to help me cut some of the miter angles correctly. We used a plasma cutter to cut the flat bar, and I have to say that this tool was pretty cool to use and a little frightening the first time. We then used a bench grinder to smooth everything out. We made screw holes with a drill press, making sure to use cutting oil to preserve the bits, and we countersunk the holes after so that the screws would be flush with the top of the flat bar. The rectangular tubing did not cut well with the plasma cutter, so we used a rotary tool and a cutting wheel instead. It took a long time, but it gave us much cleaner lines. Then everything was welded together. Connecting 1/4-inch flat bar and 16-gauge steel tubing turned out to be a bit of a problem, so we had to make some collars to act as an intermediary between these two. We used an angle grinder to clean everything up, and I learned later that I should have used a face shield in addition to the goggles. Whoops! And here they are, although upside down and with 2 coats of primer on them. Before applying the primer, I sanded the surfaces with 150 grit sandpaper and used mineral spirits to clean it all off. After priming, I lightly sanded them down with 400 grit and then used a tack cloth to clean up the dust before applying some matte black spray paint. For just using cheap spray paint, I'm really impressed with how even the coating went on, and I think the time spent prepping the surfaces made the difference. Overall, I probably put on about 3 coats of the black spray paint. To finish the slab, we brought it inside and cleaned everything off with a tack cloth. After lots of deliberation, I decided to go with Rubio Monocoat Pure. We really wanted to highlight the natural matte look of the wood, and though I'm slightly concerned that this product won't provide the level of protection a redwood table will need, it was exactly what we were looking for aesthetically. It was incredibly easy to apply. We just mixed as directed on the can and spread it over the slab. After waiting for it to soak in for a short time, we rubbed in the excess with a cloth and then repeated on the other side. We started with the bottom to make sure we had the timing correct, but it really could not have been easier. Watching the color darken and the grain pop as the coating soaked in was about the most satisfying thing I can think of. And after that, it was just a matter of flipping the slab over, measuring where we wanted the legs to be, drilling some pilot holes, and then screwing the legs on. Because of the soft wood, we set the clutch on the drill pretty low and then hand tightened everything at the end.
Ready?
Yeah,
Come on, Oh god.
Oh god.
All right. It's official.
We celebrated by testing the stability and then having our first meal on it, which was pad thai, by the way. This was our first real furniture project, and I think it really is a great starting place. There's no complicated joinery, and with the exception of the legs, no super special tools required. Just patience and some time. We learned a lot watching videos people shared on these topics, so we hope this one can help pass on that knowledge.
Hope that was helpful.
If you have any questions or feedback, leave them in the comments, and we'll see you on the next project. Thanks.
Bye.
Say bye, Truffle. You say bye. Good, good. Okay. Hi, I'm. Oh, no. Okay.
My belly hurts when I laugh.
Hi, I'm Jamie.
Okay.
Ready?
It's not funny.
I know. I'm waiting.
You're laughing and making me
I
laugh.
do.